The habit was so common it barely registered as a choice. Actors did it without thinking. Directors expected it. Crews built schedules around it. It was treated as professional hygiene, something you had to do if you wanted to be taken seriously. Anthony Hopkins refused. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply didn't do it. On his first day of a major production late in his career, a production assistant approached him with a tablet in hand, smiling politely. "Sir, we've uploaded yesterday's rehearsals for review," she said. "If you'd like to watch before we start." Hopkins shook his head gently. "No, thank you." The assistant paused, assuming she'd misheard. "Just the close-ups," she offered. "Some actors like to." "I don't," Hopkins said. She nodded, uncertain, and walked away. No one thought much of it at first. Actors had quirks. This industry ran on them. Someone didn't eat on set. Someone needed silence before a take. Someone else watched playback obsessively. Hopkins' refusal seemed harmless, until people realized it wasn't occasional. He didn't watch rehearsals. He didn't watch dailies. He didn't watch finished scenes. Not privately. Not publicly. Never. On that set, like many others before it, the habit unsettled people slowly. The director noticed first. During the second week of shooting, they wrapped a long, difficult scene, emotionally dense, technically demanding. The crew gathered around the monitors instinctively. The director replayed the take, eyes sharp, nodding. It was excellent. He turned to Hopkins, who was already stepping away, coat in hand. "Tony," the director called. "You might want to see that." Hopkins stopped, turned slightly. "Why?" The director smiled. "Because it worked." Hopkins considered that. "Then there's no reason to revisit it." The director laughed, thinking it was a joke. "It wasn't." "But what if it didn't?" the director asked. "Then you tell me," Hopkins replied. The answer was simple. Too simple. The director watched him walk away, unsettled by the absence of doubt. Actors usually chase confirmation. They negotiated with the image of themselves, searching for reassurance or correction. Hopkins refused to even look. By the third week, people were whispering, "He doesn't care how it looks. He's too confident. He doesn't want to see himself age." All wrong. The truth was quieter, and far more consequential. Hopkins had made the decision decades earlier, long before this set, long before the accolades hardened into expectation. In his early years, he had done what everyone did. He'd watched himself relentlessly, studied posture, timing, the micro-movements of his face. He believed it was discipline. First it helped, then something shifted. He began to feel the camera watching him even when it wasn't there. He adjusted moments not for truth but for effect. He stopped listening inwardly and started anticipating how things would be received. The work became smarter and emptier. That terrified him. Because acting for Hopkins had never been about appearing convincing. It was about being present. And presence couldn't survive constant self-surveillance. So he stopped. Completely. No compromise. No exceptions. He refused the habit most actors depended on. The consequences were immediate and permanent. Directors had to adjust. Some loved it. They trusted him implicitly, knowing he wasn't negotiating with an image. Others struggled, feeling unmoored without the usual feedback loop. "You don't want notes?" one director asked once. "I want direction," Hopkins replied. "Not reflection." Producers were less comfortable. "What if the audience misunderstands?" one asked after a screening. Hopkins shrugged. "Then they misunderstand honestly." That line didn't go over well. Because the industry preferred control, preferred calibration, preferred performances that could be fine-tuned until they landed safely inside expectation. Hopkins opted out of that safety. On the set in question, the consequences finally surfaced. Midway through production, a studio executive visited. He watched a scene being filmed, then approached the director. "Can we see playback?" he asked. The director nodded and gestured to the monitor. Hopkins stood off to the side, eyes elsewhere. The executive noticed. "Doesn't he want to see it?" "No," the director said carefully. "He doesn't watch himself." The executive frowned. "At all?" "No." The executive's mouth tightened. That's risky. Hopkins heard this and turned calmly. What's risky, he said. Is performing for approval you haven't earned yet. The executive stared at him. That's not how films are made, the executive replied. Hopkins smiled faintly. It's how performances are. Silence followed. Later that day, the director pulled Hopkins aside. You know you're making people nervous, he said. Hopkins nodded. Good. The director blinked. Good. Yes, Hopkins said. Nervous people pay attention. But what if they push back? The director asked. Hopkins met his gaze. They always do. And they did. There were meetings, emails, suggestions framed as concern, gentle attempts to coax him into just checking one take. Hopkins declined them all. Not stubbornly, not defensively, with consistency. That consistency forced a reckoning. Because without playback, without mirrors, without constant self-correction, Hopkins' performances began to feel different. They weren't optimized. They were lived. Moments breathed longer. Silences held weight. Scenes didn't resolve neatly. The camera adapted to him instead of the other way around. Editors noticed. You can't cut around him, one said. You have to let him be. That was dangerous language in a business built on control. And yet, the footage worked. Audiences didn't always know why, but they felt it. The refusal had consequences beyond the set. Hopkins' performances became harder to categorize, harder to predict. He stopped delivering moments and started delivering continuity. Critics struggled to summarize what he was doing, because it didn't peak where they expected. Some accused him of indifference. Others sensed something deeper. Years later, when asked directly why he refused the habit every actor depended on, Hopkins answered simply, because watching myself teaches me how to lie better. That was the rule. And he never broke it. But what most people didn't understand, what would only become clear much later, was what that refusal ultimately cost him. Not praise, not work, but something far more personal. The full weight of that cost, and why he accepted it anyway, would only surface after years of consequences had quietly accumulated. That part of the story hadn't arrived yet. Not until the industry finally realized what it had lost, and what Hopkins had preserved, by refusing to do what everyone else did. The cost didn't arrive all at once. Never does. It arrived gradually, disguised as small absences, missed invitations, conversations that cooled without explanation, roles that quietly went elsewhere, not because Hopkins couldn't do them, but because he wouldn't manage them the way the industry preferred. Studios like predictability, awards campaigns like calibration, publicists like control. Anthony Hopkins offered none of those things anymore. By refusing to watch himself, he wasn't just rejecting a habit. He was rejecting a feedback loop the entire system relied on. The loop where actors adjusted performances to optics, where scenes were shaped not by internal truth, but by how they played. Hopkins opted out. And when you opt out of a system, the system eventually notices. Meetings changed tone. Notes became cautious. Directors who once pushed for him now hesitated, unsure whether he'd be collaborative enough. Younger executives, raised on data and metrics, struggled to understand an actor who refused visual confirmation of his own work. One producer said it plainly in a closed-door meeting. He doesn't optimize. That word stuck. Optimize. As if performance were software. Hopkins heard about the comment later and laughed quietly. Not because it was insulting, but because it was accurate. He didn't optimize. He refused to sand down moments until they fit expectations. He let scenes remain slightly uneven if that unevenness felt human. The result was something audiences couldn't always articulate, but consistently felt. His performances aged differently. While others peaked early, burning bright, then repeating themselves, Hopkins' work accumulated weight. Roles from years earlier gained new meaning when revisited. Lines that once seemed incidental grew heavier with time. That wasn't accidental. It was the byproduct of refusing to polish away ambiguity. But the personal cost was real. Hopkins was no longer the first call for prestige vehicles designed to showcase great acting. Those films required actors who could shape performances around anticipated reactions, who could adjust intensity after seeing how a scene read. who could modulate themselves into a product. Hopkins couldn't do that anymore. Not because he was incapable, because he trained himself not to. He felt it most keenly during award seasons. He attended fewer events, sat through fewer screenings, politely declined roundtables where performances were dissected frame by frame. Once, a well-meaning moderator asked him, "How did you know that moment would land so powerfully?" Hopkins answered honestly, "I didn't." The room laughed, assuming humility. "It wasn't. I wasn't aiming for landing," he continued. "I was aiming for truth. Landing is the audience's job." That answer didn't play well in rooms built around analysis. Over time, Hopkins became something else entirely. Not a contender. Not a campaign. A constant. Directors who sought him out did so knowing the trade-off. They wouldn't get a performance they could sculpt endlessly. They would get something alive or nothing at all. Editors learned to work with him rather than around him. Cameras lingered longer. Cuts slowed. Silence was allowed to exist without apology. And audiences responded. Not with frenzy, with loyalty. Years later, a younger actor approached him quietly after a screening. "I've been told to watch myself constantly," the actor said, "to fix what doesn't work." Hopkins studied him for a moment. "Does it help?" The actor hesitated. "It helps me feel safer." Hopkins nodded. "That's what it's for." "For safety." "Yes," Hopkins said. "Not for art." The actor frowned. "So you think it's bad?" Hopkins shook his head. "I think it's useful early on. And dangerous if you never stop." That was as close as he came to advice. Because Hopkins never framed his refusal as a moral stance. He didn't preach it. He didn't recommend it universally. He simply lived with its consequences. The greatest consequence wasn't professional. It was internal. By never watching himself, Hopkins never got the comfort of seeing himself succeed. He never relived applause. Never revisited triumphs. Never reassured himself that he was still good. Every role began from uncertainty. Every performance was released into the world without confirmation. That required a kind of emotional austerity most people couldn't tolerate. But it gave him something rare. He never became bored with himself. He never chased his own shadow. He never confused past success with presentability. Late in his career, when asked how he stayed engaged after decades of work, he answered simply, "I don't know what I look like anymore." People laughed. They missed the point. What he meant was that he hadn't turned himself into an object of study. He remained a participant rather than an observer. He stayed inside the work instead of hovering above it. That was the permanent consequence of his refusal. He traded reassurance for presence, familiarity for discovery, control for attention. And once you make that trade long enough, there's no going back. Hopkins couldn't suddenly start watching himself even if he wanted to. The habit was broken beyond repair. The distance between the man performing and the man observing had been closed permanently. That terrified some people. Freed him. When one final interviewer asked, near the end of a long career, whether he'd do anything differently, Hopkins thought carefully. "No," he said. "I learned to stop looking." "Looking at what?" the interviewer asked. "Myself," Hopkins replied. "It's the quickest way to stop listening." That was the ending. Not a dramatic revelation. Not a triumphant justification. Just the quiet acknowledgement that by refusing the habit every actor depended on, Anthony Hopkins had preserved the one thing most of them eventually lost: the ability to remain present. And that, more than any role, any award, any moment of recognition, was the consequence he was willing to accept forever.